Welcome to I Hate James Dobson. It's okay. You're safe now.
Oh, that one.
Welcome to I Hate James Dobson. My name is Jake. I'm a marriage and family therapist. And today, as with every day, I'm joined by my dear friend, delightful colleague, and the dazzling and decadent dandy herself, Brooke.
Oh, that was a good one.
Hi, Brooke.
Hi, Jake. You gave me 4 D adjectives because D is the 4th letter of the alphabet.
Yeah, that's why. Definitely not the influence of cannabis.
I want everyone to know something. By the time this airs, I'll be a year older.
Yay! Happy birthday. How was your birthday?
It was so great.
I literally have "How was your birthday" written down.
It was incredible.
What was your favorite gift?
I think my favorite gift was the one you gave me, Jake.
The gift of friendship.
No. Not that one. That really expensive gift that you gave me, remember?
I can't believe that we are less than a week away from the official start of fall. That's right. Next Sunday, September 22nd, is the first day of fall.
Happy Pride!
For new readers out there, this is a bit because we're recording before both of those events happen. Last episode, we read through The Strong-Willed Child, Dobson's most infamous work. There were some decent enough, if oversimplistic, pieces of parenting advice, especially as it relates to ADHD. Today, we're throwing out any praise for Dobson.
Yeah.
The Strong-Willed Child is perhaps the book with the most significant legacy. And it's not because of the parenting advice. It's about the ideology underneath. And that's our focus today, taking Dobson's ideology head-on, exploring both how it shapes his view of child-rearing and how he is only accidentally correct. We're going to talk about why Dobson is deeply and insultingly incorrect about pretty much everything in the world.
Great.
Full disclosure, I had started reading The Strong-Willed Child right after Dare to Discipline, Ka-chow. I'd stopped reading it because I got through the first chapter and it felt so closely related. It was all about spanking and I got bored, to be honest. I felt like another bad book, but not super interesting. And oh my god, was I wrong.
Oh no.
Throughout this book, Dobson alternates between actual parenting advice and crazy mini-sermons, especially in those Q&As at the end of every chapter like we've talked about. For instance, there's a whole chapter about what's called parent effectiveness training. This is a model of parenting advice, some classes that you can do. In this Q&A, in this chapter, Dobson is talking about why kids need authority figures. He then goes on to tell a parable of his pet hamster, who's desperate to break out of his cage, and a return mention of his dog Siggy. He named his dog Sigmund Freud.
Ugh.
His dog Siggy is desperate to violently tear this hamster apart. Dobson can see that the hamster's desire for freedom would, quote, bring him instant and violent death if he should be so unfortunate to achieve it. There are occasions which the longings and desires of our children would be harmful or disastrous if granted. Then my thoughts meandered a bit further to my own relationship with God and the quest that I submit to him in personal prayer. I wonder how many of those times I'd asked him to open the door to my cage, not appreciating the security it was providing. I resolved to accept his negative answers with greater submission in the future. It's about parent effectiveness training. This is a move that Dobson often pulls, which is something that I've described in the past as talking like a bad preacher. He takes some folksy anecdote or metaphor, fills it with a bunch of unnecessary personal information, and then extrapolates the symbology to create some literal understanding of God. It's the same move as those youth pastor jokes. Like a youth pastor sits down and says, everyone these days is so worried about their followers on Twitter. It doesn't matter how many followers you had. Jesus had 12. Okay. That's just not the point.
Really quickly, did James Dobson compare children to a hamster in a cage?
Yes.
But remember in our last episode when he said children are not mice?
Yeah, hamsters, not mice.
Oh, okay.
Also, he compares himself to a hamster in a cage as well.
He is a hamster in a cage.
But it's not science. It's not a study. So.
Oh, okay.
That's
then it's okay. I'd like to see him running on one of those little wheels, though.
Oh my god. I think, though, that these anecdotes work because it tickles our brain. It makes emotional sense. It feels like he has a point. And this book is full of that. But to really understand Dobson's ideology of this book, we do have to talk about the culture into which he's writing. So let's take a short detour to talk about the academic theories of education and philosophy. I've labeled this section of the script, so the 70s were weird, huh? So the United States was at its height after World War II. Due to our relative geographic independence, our ridiculous military, and general isolationist policies, the US was pretty truly in charge of the world at that point. We poured money into other countries to rebuild them in our image. America was one of the only, quote, Western countries not to be bombed to hell and back, and thus had a pretty tremendous period of economic prosperity. For white people, and for white men specifically. But this is why part of the reason why the 50s are remembered so fondly. America's futures really did seem limitless. I don't know if you know this, Brooke. America kind of sucks.
Yeah, I have heard that.
And by the 70s, the saccharine narratives of the 50s had truly begun to show the resulting decay. The United States was in a Cold War with the USSR. We're in wars all over the world, and most of them hugely unpopular. The CIA was up to all sorts of fuckery, including things like the Bay of Pigs, and utterly decimating any South American government that dared not to wholly serve the U.S. interests. The Vietnam War was hugely unpopular, and although it finally officially ended 3 years before this book was published, it had disillusioned an entire generation of America. And baby boomers were now fully grown and realizing that the American dream was a mirage meant to propel non-rich people into endless cycles of exploitation. All of that to say, Americans were not super thrilled about being obedient to their government at this point. Ideas of authority were being questioned, paralleling postmodernism as a philosophical movement. We've talked about postmodernism before, but as a brief recap, postmodernism comes after modernism, so it's postmodernism. Modernism is the look for objective truth. Postmodernism questioned what even means to be objective. How do we know what we know? What assumptions are baked into understandings of truth? Postmodernism remains a boogeyman of evangelicals and conservatives. Truth is relative, God is dead, are made into strawman arguments to eliminate the depravity of our hedonistic culture. While all of that was going on, academia was having weird, echo-chambery discussions about philosophy that feel so far removed from the true human experiences as to almost be irrelevant. In other words, it was academia. Dobson cites a few different academic theorists and philosophies, like pretty directly. He's responding as much to the broader culture as to the specific people he considers his contemporaries. In the very first chapter, he talks about the philosophical idea, for instance, that humans are born as blank slates. Everything that we know and are is acquired. It's the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate. Clearly, this is an actual debate. There are inborn characteristics that are influenced by lived experience. It is both nature and nurture, and that economy is not as stark as the question itself poses it to be. And Dobson agrees with that, broadly at least. But this idea of being a blank slate was fairly popular in academic, especially educational understandings. The people who created the first IQ test did so in French schools with the belief that kids were a blank slate that we had to pour information into. I believe the philosopher John Locke, who was pretty influential in current understandings of like liberty and rights of men, also believed this idea. This is a quote from Dobson. Numerous authorities in the field of child development now agree that these complex little creatures are called babies are far from the blank slates when they enter the world. It's true. But he uses this to justify that some people are just born born strong-willed.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
Quote, just as surely as some children are naturally compliant, there are others who seem to be defiant upon exit of the womb. We talked about this quote last time. They come into the world smoking a cigar and yelling about the temperature of the delivery room and the incompetence of the nursing staff and the way things are run by the administration of the hospital. Again, it's just like inborn characteristic. We are born with certain natures, right? For sure. There is some just inborn characteristics. But those things play off of the nurture that we receive. Even things as fundamental to us as a personality have that interplay between the two. Mm-hmm. What was going on in academia at the time of James Dobson's writing? It's time to introduce you, I'm so excited, Brooke, to James Dobson's love interest. And this is canon, for me at least. Dr. Benjamin Spock.
Oh, Dr. Spock.
Have you heard of this person before?
Yeah, of course, Dr. Spock.
What do you know about Dr. Spock?
Dr. Spock was,
I had never heard of him before this.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I know about this because everyone would always get him confused with Mr. Spock. Mm-hmm. Jake just made the Star Trek thing. Yeah, and so everyone thought it was funny that his name was Dr. Spock when I was growing up. But also remember, I grew up in the 80s, so he was a big player at that time, right? So he wrote books about child rearing. Right? Yeah.
This is Dobson's introduction to him. Quote, Dr. Benjamin Spock is loved by millions of children who have grown up under his influence. But I, apparently, am resented by an entire generation of kids who'd like to catch me in a blind alley on some cloudy night.
What?
They're like, oh, all the kids loved Dr. Spock, but they hate me. Which is true. But Dobson's like, clearly that shows that I was the better one. Persecution complex.
Right, because I guess, I mean, that's what I know about Dr. Spock, but he's not, like, controversial, is he?
Not particularly.
No, he's not religious. He's not part of this, right?
No, he's not part of this.
Okay.
He's controversial for other reasons, and
Sure.
we'll get into it. So, what is he known for? Dr. Benjamin Spock was an American pediatrician and left-wing political activist. His most well-known book is used what we would call positive psychology today. Its main message was to tell mothers, you know more than you think you do. He was a pediatrician who used psychoanalysis to understand family dynamics. So I am a marriage and family therapist, but this field of marriage and family therapy didn't really exist at the time. So this was pretty new, at least in like academic white spaces. He was seen culturally as an icon of permissive parenting. He was also a self-described socialist, was big in the anti-Vietnam movement, and ran for president as the People's Party nominee in 1972, pushing for a maximum wage, so a cap on what you can earn, legalized abortion, and withdrawing troops from all foreign countries.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that. It's just badass. So, this is an episode about ideologies, and you can see how a socialist ideology like this would lead to a better way of parenting than this weird Christian nationalist ideology of James Dobson. Dobson read an article by Spock where Spock said that many of the reasons parents were adverse to discipline were they were afraid to hurt their kids' feelings, and the parents must provide consistent boundaries to establish safety. Which is correct. Dobson was shocked to read this from the icon of permissive parenting and wrote a letter to thank him and included a copy of Dare to Discipline in this letter.
I want you to know something culturally. So you had never heard of Dr. Spock.
Mm-mm.
So, you know, I didn't really know anything about James Dobson. I maybe had heard about him, but certainly not, like, couldn't name who he is. And when I tell people about this podcast, most people don't know who I'm talking about, who didn't grow up in this. But I want you to know that everyone knew who Dr. Spock was, right? Like, it was like Dr. Ruth. Like, he was part of jokes. He was part of, like, late night TV. Like, his name was everywhere.
Yeah.
Right? And so you wouldn't have been a person living in America in the 70s, 80s who didn't know who that was.
My current supervisor is
Your current supervisor, Belinda?
Belinda, yeah. Is a marriage and family therapist who has been in the field for a hot second now. And when I brought this up to her in my supervision, she's like, oh yeah, I know all about Dr. Spock.
Yeah.
So in this letter that Dobson wrote to Dr. Spock, so he's like, oh my God, I love that you say discipline's important. Quote, in actuality, neither of us formulated those principles which you expressed so eloquently in this article. They were inspired by the creator of children more than 2,000 years ago. Isn't it interesting that he's always right in the final analysis?
Okay. He's so jelly.
This made me laugh out loud. Dr. Spock wrote back and said, quote, actually, my article contains nothing that I haven't said again and again for 25 years. So basically he's like, shut the fuck up.
Yeah.
What do you do? No, this isn't new. They didn't learn anything. Don't come at me like this. So I have zero proof of this, but I just imagine Spock politely tolerating Dobson, who now thinks that they're best friends. There's literally like 7 pages where Dobson's just talking about Dr. Spock. I wrote there's literally 7 pages of Dobson jerking Spock off, which I think is a very funny sentence. Dr. Spock was like, maybe we should try to help regulate our kids and not be punitive in the punishments. Maybe positive reinforcement is more effective than punishment. Yeah.
Right.
So, and then we have a chapter on parent effectiveness training. Called...
Wait, I'm confused. I'm sorry. Dobson liked Dr. Spock?
Mm-hmm.
Even after that whole thing you just told me about him?
Oh, because I read that as Spock being like, shut the fuck up. Dobson didn't take it that way.
Okay.
Dobson loves this guy. They've met. They've been on like talk shows together.
He's
really his like. He's mentioned multiple times in different chapters. Each like he criticizes him a little bit for various things, but like really like super positive on the guy. I don't think Dr. Spock cares about Dobson at all. No, again, I have no evidence for this, but
weird. Even though he's like pro-abortion and all that stuff.
Because he thinks we need to discipline our kids.
Great. Okay, got it.
Also, Dr. Spock is not anti-spanking necessarily, or wasn't anti-spanking. He wasn't necessarily for. He was like surprisingly neutral on it, from what I could find. His widow, in an interview after his death, was like he didn't really like it, but it wasn't his focus. Anyway, we're talking about like what's going on in the cultural zeitgeist around like ideas of parenting, discipline. So this is when parent effectiveness training is really taking effect. Parent effectiveness training, PET, is a model of parenting that asserts that you can parent, you can help correct children's behaviors without punitive punishment. It advocates a no-lose method of solving conflict. So if you want your kid to go to bed on time, they want a new toy, you give them like $3 every time they go to bed on time so they can save up for the new toy, right? A no-lose situation. It treats kids like people, albeit people who are still learning how to navigate the world. One particular part of the culture war at the time, which this relates to, is the children's rights movement. Do you know anything about the children's rights movement? No, I don't. I hadn't heard of it either. The concept of children having particular rights is a relatively new one. Traditional attitudes towards children tended to consider them as mere extensions of the household and owned by their parents or legal guardians who exerted absolute parental control. Now, our ideas of that, one, as with everything, have not been consistent throughout time, but really began to be challenged in a mainstream way during the Enlightenment period, which is like hundreds of years before James Dobson is writing. If all men are created equal, with certain unalienable rights endowed to them by their creator, when are those rights endowed? Is it when you turn 18? Is it when you're born? Was it before you're born? This is still an ongoing kind of philosophical and political debate. This movement, though, was also connected to the end of child labor, at least until Republicans brought it back because the children yearn for the mines. The League of Nations, the precursor to the UN, published 5 principles of children's rights in 1923. Again, these ideas, Dobson's railing against it as like a modern movement, but this is not true. It's been going on very specifically for a really long time, even though our ideas of parenting were being shaped by it during the 70s and 80s. We were at so many levels redefining what it meant to be a child. That you are a full person, entitled to your own rights, that you deserve to be treated kindly, not to be physically hit, to be taught with kindness how to be a person in the world, not an obedient piece of property your parents get bragging rights over. Dobson hates that and cherry picks some of the worst examples for it. He describes this idea, children are people, as, quote, children, whatever age, should have the right to experience sex, drink and use drugs, drive, vote, work, own property, etc. That's not really what people were saying.
No. Come on, Jimmy.
Dobson says he opposes things like PET because parents give up authority or that they lose a crucial tool for behavior modification without spanking that irreparably changes the parent-child relationship. But that's not really his point. Like, that's a criticism. That's not really the fundamental point under it. The essence of the PET philosophy, however, is expressed in the no-win, no-lose approach to parent-child relationships. According to this system, says Dobson, solutions are sought to conflicts which are acceptable to both parties. Obviously, there's a time and place for negotiation in human affairs, whether it be between father and son, husband and wife, or Henry Kissinger and the Arabs.
Okay.
I want to shoot myself, says Dobson. Quote, my concern about PET, then, is not in its use of the conference table when the situation warrants. Rather, it's the rejection of parental authority in any form. Yielding to loving leadership of their parents, children are also learning to yield to the benevolent leadership of God himself. It is a well-known fact that a child identifies his parents with God. And there it is. That's the ideology here, front and center. This is about creating people to fit into not just citizens of the world, but to be Dobson's very specific idea of what it means to be a Christian. Before we really dig into it, let's just laugh about it for a second.
Yeah.
He jerks God off for a page.
I wonder what Dobson would think. Have you heard about today's movement, which is called childism? Right?
I know a little bit about it. I don't know Dobson. I can imagine Dobson's views, but I haven't read anything about Dobson.
Yeah, I think we always know Dobson's views.
What is childism?
Childism is this idea that now in the culture we live in, people are really exploiting their children, right? For fame or for TikToks or whatever, right? And is that appropriate? Is that fair? And is that something you can do when a kid can't really give consent?
Yeah.
Right? And then what is the long-term effect of that? So it's like any other ism where it's kind of like putting children second or children's needs second or classifying them in one way, right? And really, there's been a big response to it. Like, people have taken down their videos and all of this stuff because we've had reality TV as it looks today now for over 20 years, right? And people are starting to talk about the consequences of it, which I find fascinating.
It's really interesting, yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of those people are people who were children on shows and grew up and now are like, hey, I don't really appreciate that was the childhood I had and I didn't really have a say in it.
Yeah.
You know? Not to mention not getting paid. I mean, we'll do a big episode at some point about the Duggars, but not getting paid for any of it, right? Or not like having a real kind of childhood because of it.
I know it's not reality TV, but Jeanette McCurdy
Oh, yeah. I love that book.
recently wrote a book called I'm Glad My Mom Died.
Yeah.
Really good book. And in it, she was a child star. And when she turned 18, her parents spent all of the money. So she had no money from her entire childhood being labor.
Right. A lot of times parents will act as a manager or as some role for the children. And then that's how they are able to sort of siphon that money.
Conservatorships are also that. You are now my property. Even like we saw with Britney Spears, people take advantage of that really easily. But even like well-meaning people puts you in this super, like, even if you don't want it to be that, your children are then in effect your property.
Right. Yeah. And now, well, maybe this has always been true, but I think it's more prevalent now. Like, there's like child advocates in courtrooms and stuff because kids don't know what to do or what to say, right? Like,
Yeah.
And so there are people there to help make sure that children's best interests are being seen.
That has definitely not been the case. In the 90s version of the Satanic Panic, it really got kickstarted because people, psychologists and police were asking kids really leading questions about, like, did this happen to you in school? And kids are dumb as fuck. And so they don't have the best grasp on logic and reality. And so but they do respond to emotions. They're giving the answers that people wanted. And it went from, I think my kid might have been molested at school, to they are flushing kids down the train to be sacrificed in ritualistic ceremonies to Satan. Which, like, they were just egging these kids on.
Yeah. I mean, that's what's so silly about this. It's like, we're not saying, okay, yeah, let kids gamble and vote and drink and all that stuff, right? But we are saying, like, yes, of course, kids are human people on the planet and they have rights. And they, I think, have the right to not be exploited and not be abused and all of those things, right? And who stands up for them?
And I would say the right not to be physically hit or hurt, unless I'm specifically asking for it, or whether through like a fun, sexy consent way, or I'm physically hurting someone else. I don't want other people to inflict pain upon me.
Right.
I'd be super fucking mad if they did that.
Right.
So Dobson says, quote, "The universe is ordered by a supreme lord."
It sounds so scary.
Sorry, lord is also an insult. So, like, you're being such a fucking lord right now. So, universe is run by some guy named Chad. Anyway, the universe is ordered by a supreme lord who requires obedience from his children and has warned them that, quote, "the wages of sin is death. To show our little ones love without authority is as serious a distortion of God's nature as to reveal an iron-fisted authority without love."
Even the way that you have described him talking about children in both of these episodes, it's like these little teeny scrappy doodle bugs. It's like he doesn't really even see them as human in some ways.
No. There's a whole chapter, we didn't get into this, there's a whole chapter on, like, parenting the strong-willed adolescent. It's actually not all that bad. Because I think he can identify with the thinking and logic and humanity of an adolescent. But the mind of a child, although he's worked with children, I don't think he really gets. Clearly he doesn't. From Dobson again, quote, "To repeat, a child learns to yield to the authority of God by first learning to submit rather than bargain to the leadership of his parents." As much as this is advice for parents, it really is about creating a populace that is submissive and obedient in the way that James Dobson views Christianity.
Right. Gross.
Dobson's actual reason for writing this book is to whine about how people have turned away from God, and the parenting advice is just a mean to those ends. Like I mentioned last episode, this book serves as a really interesting point in Dobson's career. He had just left the APA 3 years ago, because gay, and was in the middle of fully shifting to focus on the family. So he was right in the middle of a guy with a PhD that works in actual hospitals, and radio preacher, grifter bigot. And this book captures that beautifully. And as this book goes on, literally chapter by chapter, it gets more explicitly a pre-Christo-fascist text, which we would later see come to culmination in things like bringing up boys or bringing up girls. To say that Dobson's goal is to spread Christian parenting, however, is also untrue, or at least incredibly oversimplistic, because Christianity isn't just one thing. He advocates for one very specific type of parenting based on his personal religious beliefs, sure, but there are so many other Christian parents, including Christian parenting experts, who flat out disagree with him. Christianity isn't just evangelicalism. It's Catholicism, Presbyterians, it's the Church of England, it's Pentecostals, it's non-denominationals, even Mormons, depending on how you cut it. While Dobson is careless and stubborn-headed in his analysis, I strive to be precise in my level of petty. Much like his parenting advice, he uses the language of Christianity to advance his own agenda. However, this time, he isn't even an expert on the subject matter. He admits this, although feigningly, quote, "Though I'm technically unqualified to extend this principle into the area of theology, I will share my personal views. But you're only technically qualified to do this for psychology." It's not even really qualified. Whatever, you have some letters after your name. Quote, "We had to understand the scope of God's majesty and authority, and even his wrath, before we could comprehend the depth of his love expressed through the life and death of Jesus. Thus, it is logical that he gave us the content of the Old Testament before the New." I cannot stand this. Not only do I find this lack of curiosity and self-criticism boring and insulting, it is deeply and dangerously self-serving. It's not even based on theology. It blends metaphor and literalism to the point of injury, twisting facts to build the narrative that he already wanted. And then, because he uses the Bible to justify it, he doesn't have to look any deeper. Actually, to look any deeper would be blasphemous and disobedient. His extremely limited and totally anecdotal slogan is ascribed to the Word of God. This is what we mean when we say Dobson claims to speak for God. The Bible just straight up never says a lot of these things. There's no rich tradition of theology that says the layout of the Bible is because we must first understand the law before we can understand love. That's just something Dobson said. This obviously isn't to say that you can't be a Christian and be a scientist, although I don't think I implied this. But to be clear, you can. You can have any faith or spiritual beliefs, or even none, and be intellectually curious. Conversely, some of the least curious and most frustrating people I know are angsty atheist guys online.
That's true.
But actual intellectual curiosity means putting aside our own biases as much as we can. It means truly grappling with the possibility that maybe you're wrong. One more quote. Quote, "Few things concern me more for Christian laymen than for ministers to excuse one of these divine messages of love and justice to the exclusion of the other. The more common distortion in this permissive day is to let go of the extreme, is to go to the opposite extreme, depicting God as a doting grandfather who winks at sin and ignores the disobedience of his children. Nowhere in the Bible is this description found. Without an understanding of justice of our Creator and our obligation to serve him, his promise to punish wickedness, Jesus' death on the cross is of no consequence. He died to provide a remedy for the curses of sin. Unless one understands the curse, the disease, then there is no need for a cure." So reevaluating parental authority means you hate Jesus. That's what he's saying. That's not even like an extrapolation or me being silly. If you don't understand the punishment that you are owed for this thing, the punishment of disobeying your parents means spanking, then you can't understand Jesus' death on the cross.
Okay.
So he says he's not qualified in theology, but then he just preaches theology for pretty much his entire career.
Yeah, he does. This is where I started to dissociate usually.
I wrote, cool and stuff, but how does this relate to spanking?
Yeah.
I'm not very glad you asked. I think this is really important to understand Dobson's ideology. Quote, "The entire human race is afflicted with the same tendency toward willful defiance that this 3-year-old exhibited." He gives a specific example, but her behavior in the gym is not so different from the folly of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. God told them they could eat anything in the garden except the forbidden fruit. Yet they challenged the authority of the Almighty by deliberately disobeying his commandment. Perhaps this tendency towards self-will is the essence of original sin, which has infiltrated the human family. So literally, that being strong-willed, having that will, is sin. That is the essence of sin, according to Dobson. This is the most important point. But also, if Adam and Eve didn't have the knowledge of good and evil, how could they understand that what they're doing was wrong?
Right.
Also, Adam and Eve didn't exist.
Right. I was just about to say that. Also, speaking of folksy parables.
Uh-huh. And the way that the Old Testament, the way that Genesis was written, was never meant to be a literal historical document. It was always meant to be understood through the language of metaphor. Now, you don't have to like that. You don't have to like the metaphor that they're going for. That's fine. But Christians, creationists especially, in which Dobson alludes to creationism a number of times, saying these principles have been around for 2,000 years or whatever. He mentions 5,000 years later on. That's a really, really recent development in Christian ideology. It's completely ahistorical. Let's recap what we know about his ideology so far.
Okay, but I wasn't totally conscious during all that.
That's why the recap's important.
Okay, let's hear it.
Children have a will that must be shaped.
Yes.
The will is because we are sinful.
Yes, definitely.
In fact, we are so sinful, we can't trust ourselves.
Uh-huh.
There's some verses that he cites from the Bible that we talked about in purity culture that make a recurrence here, such as Jeremiah wrote, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" Dobson says Jeremiah's inspired insight into human nature is validated by the sordid nature of history of mankind. The record of civilization is blotted by murder, war, rape, and plundering from the time of Adam forward. Surely during those thousands of years there must have been at least one generation for whom parents did things right, yet greed, lust, and selfishness have characterized us all.
So really the takeaway in all of these books, in all of James Dobson, is like, we want to have ultimate control over everybody. We, the Christian nationalists, right? And so we have to convince you from the time you are born, before you're even born, that you can't trust yourself, that you're wrong, that you're sinful.
Mm-hmm.
And then, we have to mold you into who we are. So we have really ultimate control.
We have to mold you to who God wants you to be.
Yeah, but really
according
it's
to us,
who we want you to be.
Yes.
Right.
I still have some internal pushback to some of that. Not because I think you're wrong. I think you're absolutely correct. That's what they're doing. But because I've tried to point this out to many evangelicals in my life many, many times. And there's always this pushback of that's not what we're trying to do. Because they will say, and I think a lot of them actually believe that they're trying to lead people to God. Mm. But the practical effects of what they're doing is creating a hierarchy where they're at the top and they control everyone else. And whether or not that's quote unquote their intention, that is clearly the result of the things that they're advocating for.
Right, because...
And they don't grapple with that.
What would their response be to someone who was like, I 100% believe in God, I 100% believe in Jesus, but I do not follow most of these teachings?
Then you're wrong. You don't actually love God. You don't actually love Jesus. And you're lying to yourself.
And that's the control piece, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which is why the main thesis of this book and most of the ideology, most of the books that we've talked about, most of the things we've talked about in this podcast, it's about obedience. Mm-hmm. Don't think. You cannot think for yourself.
That's right.
Your heart is wicked and deceitful above all things. You cannot trust it. Instead, trust this. Trust the Bible. Trust what I say the Bible says. Mm-hmm. Any act of ours that isn't aligned with the Bible, and in this case, I mean Dobson's view of the Bible, therefore is a manifestation of that will, of that sin. Sin must be punished in this ideology as well. So, parents are to children what God is to us. We are God's children, and therefore, we should parent the way that God governs over us. Our interactions are a reflection of that dynamic. So since God punishes sin with death, parent must punish willfulness with violence. It's just the correct thing to do.
Wow. What a fucking stretch.
Right? I don't think that me saying this is a stretch of Dobson's ideology. But oh my God, what a fucked up thing. And I think somewhere in my brain that I knew this, but it wasn't until I had to sit down and write out what was going on that I was really like, wow, that is exactly what is going on here.
Yeah. Whoa.
Not only is punishment effective in correcting behavior, but Dobson doesn't care if it's behavioral modification. Doesn't care if it's really effective. It's the correct thing to do. The morally correct thing to do.
And I know I've said this before. It's like, I agree. Like, maybe there isn't a conscious... I mean, I think for Dobson there is, but maybe there isn't a conscious, we're trying to be in control. But there's certainly this, when we talk about, the umbrella of the home, right, the structure. I've said this in a different episode, so you can cut it. But, God isn't physically there, so dad is God.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
And it's like, how can I, who would want to lose that power position? Right?
Yes.
So how can I keep that structure going for generations? Because that is the one that serves me really well.
Yeah.
Right?
Something that is actually a really important dynamic in this, right? Yeah, God's the authority, so I'm yielding to God. But God is not physically present in your home. And so if you're saying, I'm just listening to God's authority, you're not.
Right. And as like the dad, who then is the head of the household, it's very easy to be like, yeah, God, I'm doing that. That's fine. Because you're not really actually being held accountable by anyone else, because none of the other dads want to lose their power position either. Right.
I am not an evangelical because I do not agree with any of the beliefs, really. But some of the personal experiences that I had that were incredibly frustrating were me trying to say, hey, I don't think that this is right. I don't think your interpretation of this is right. And not only, no, I disagree with you, it's you are not listening to God.
Oof.
It's this direct appeal to authority that says, I know what God is saying. You're not listening to God, so I'm going to tell you that wrong. Not what I believe, not my interpretation. No, you're not listening to God.
Wow.
Quote, my entire book, says Dobson, this entire book, The Strong-Willed Child, is a product of the biblical orientation to human nature. We are not typically kind and loving and generous and yielding to God. Our tendency is towards selfishness and stubbornness and sin. We are all, in effect, strong-willed children as we stand before God. The Christian parent hopes to lead his child to Jesus Christ, who alone can cleanse him of his rebellion. It's a very old explanation of human nature, and it sounds terribly unscientific, but the Bible teaches it, and I believe it. There's a couple important things to me in that. One, that we're all strong-willed children, that this idea of, again, personality is what makes you you. Your personality, you are inherently wrong. But second of all, Jesus Christ, who alone can cleanse him of this rebellion. To be perfected is to not have that will, is to not have that sense of individuality, is to not actually be you.
Right.
The last chapter in this book is called The Eternal Source. Here, Dobson lays naked his beliefs, and the real motivations become pretty easy to see. There's a lot of really long quotes. Let me see which ones are the best.
The best.
I think this is important. Quote, now admittedly, the book you've been reading about the strong-willed child also contains many suggestions and perspectives which I have not attempted to validate or prove. He's claiming that a lot of a Dr. Spock will say something and just doesn't have to prove it. How do my writings differ from the unsupported recommendations of the sources who I've criticized? The distinction lies in the source of the views being presented. The underlying principles herein are not my own innovated insights, which would be forgotten in a brief season or two. Instead, they originated in the inspired biblical writers who gave us the foundation for all relationships. As such, these principles have been handed down generation after generation to this very day. If I have a primary mission writing this book, therefore, it is not to earn royalty or propagate the name of James Dobson, demonstrating my professional skill. It is.
Yeah, it is.
My purpose has been nothing more ambitious than to verbalize the Judeo-Christian tradition regarding discipline of children and apply those concepts to today's families. What a fucking ego on this asshole. Oh, it's not me. I'm just reporting what God says. Oh, I'm not doing this for my own validation. Don't worry the fact that I've sold 2 million copies of A Nomedan Empire. This is tangential, but I found this out. I have been obsessing over this. Dobson has at least created 3 organizations that are co-sponsors of Project 2025.
Oh, God.
It absolutely is to elevate yourself. One is literally called the James Dobson Family Institute. Go fuck yourself, James Dobson. You're doing this for yourself.
Of course it's about him.
But it's this feigning of humility. It's not for me. It's because of God. It's not my words. It's God's words. Mm-hmm. Another quote in this vein. One more for the road. I sympathize with someone else in his suspicion of human wisdom. I would lack confidence, too, if I had no standard or guide upon which to base my parental judgments and determinations. However, the Christian mother and father need not lean on their own understanding, which is a biblical term, for they have access to the wisdom of God himself. The creator of the universe and earth and little children has shared his knowledge with us in the form of eternal truths. It is apparent to me as I consider the fundamentals of parent effectiveness training that it does not draw the precepts and inspiration from the same interpretations of biblical principles on which I depend. In fact, I'm inclined to see the system as one only of recent offerings in the field of psychology, which blatantly contradict the Judeo-Christian ethic. Traditions which have been honored for several thousands of years are suddenly vilified. Not even the flag, motherhood, or apple pie are safe. Important tie nationalism there at the very end.
Of course. Motherhood, apple pie. What do you say, the flag?
Flag, motherhood, and apple pie.
Shut up.
I don't watch or particularly care for Family Guy, but there's a pretty famous clip where Lois, the mother, is running for some board, and she just goes, 9/11, and everyone stands up and claps. He's just doing this here.
Yeah.
But he's doing it unironically.
Okay, but can you say 3 other things that conjure up the same thing without using motherhood, apple pie, or flag?
Yes. Military, beer, football.
Oh, football. That's a good one. Yeah. Okay. Troops, hunting, and ketchup.
Ketchup. Okay, now we're coming for me in this. I don't appreciate it. His agenda is, I'm right. I'm speaking for God. It's not my beliefs. It's just what's in the Bible.
How can anyone, this is going to be a little side tangent, I'm sorry. How can anyone ever say that and believe that? Like, I know what I feel. I'm talking about, like, your spirituality or your, but, like, how can you ever say, like, 100% I know for a fact, right?
It's the opposite of faith. I have my own spiritual and religious beliefs that we don't need to get all that into at least right now. But I'm also very aware that I'm just some fuckhead in the year 2024. I don't know fuck all. I don't know if there is a God. I don't even know what God would mean in this context. I have my beliefs, but I'm also very open to the idea that I am wrong.
Yeah, same. Like,
and that's what faith is.
Yeah. I think I have some of that. Like, I guess I consider myself agnostic, but the truth is that I don't really think about it at all. It's like, I don't have a religious system. You know what I mean? I have a value system and a moral code, but I don't have a religious system. So, but sure, I guess I could die and show up at some pearly gates and be like, whoops, I was wrong.
Dobson does not want ambiguity. Dobson does not want possibilities that he is wrong. He wants certainty, and he wants to be certain that he is correct. When I was an evangelical, I knew that God was real. It felt so, I knew it in my bones. It was capital T true to me. And I know that that's how I felt. I don't feel that way anymore.
Right.
But there was a comfort in that certainty.
Sure. And that I understand and that I can appreciate. It's so interesting to me because, like, feeling something doesn't make it true still, right? So you can feel that way and you can believe that, and that can bring you all this comfort, and I get it, right? I'm not asking people to deny their beliefs, but it's just like, I just don't know how people can say, like, this is for sure, to the detriment of others, right? Like, this is 100% true.
I'm not asking people to deny their beliefs. I'm asking for some fucking humility.
Right.
I know that you believe that. I'm sure whatever your belief is, you probably have a really good reason for believing that. And also, you might be wrong. And that's okay. That doesn't discredit your beliefs or spirituality.
Right.
In therapy, the framework that I was given in school that I really appreciated, like, the client is the expert in their own life.
Of course.
I have all the theories of therapy. I had to take a whole fucking test where I had to, like, memorize and synthesize all these together. But also, if a client tells me this is my experience, I'm not going to be like, no, it's not. That's not real. Right. We can dig into it. We can question it. But if that's true for them, that is just true for them. And to say you're wrong or you're lying to yourself not only is incorrect, what a fucking dick I would be.
Right. But then the flip of that is, like, if they say this is my experience and I really believe it, and now it has to be your experience too. And if you don't believe it, you're wrong and you're whatever, right? Like, that's where it gets so dangerous. Like, believe whatever you want, but when you start imposing that on other people and saying this is the only way, I mean,
I try not to do it very much, but it is wild to talk to transphobes because some of them just truly cannot fathom the idea that people are actually trans.
Right.
And to be like, I know that you feel very confident in the body that you are born in, that feels correct for you, that your gender and biologic sex and gender expression all line up really easily. Absolutely. I'm not here to question that for you. But could you imagine for a second that someone doesn't have that same experience as you? And it's really hard for a lot of people when they're so invested in these beliefs.
Yeah. And then it's like, and then the next question is like, imagine being so 100% solid in your gender, right? In your gender identity, and then not being in a body that matches that.
Yes.
It's the same feeling, right? It's just that one person got a body that matches and one person didn't, you know? And that's I think the piece that really gets confusing for people sometimes.
Yeah. The Bible is open to interpretation. And evangelicals hate when you say that. But it's just objectively true. When I was in the church and was hearing pastors will rail against like postmodernism, people say the Bible is open to interpretation. And they'll point to things like the Bible says murder is wrong. But is that open to interpretation? That's not really what we're talking about here. Dobson has an example here. He talks about a story to explain why discipline is important to kids. So this Bible story is there's a priest of God who had two sons who worked in the temple. Called a tabernacle back then. This isn't theology class, doesn't matter. The two sons were total fuckheads, and so God punished the dad. Previously, this bloodline was promised to be priests of the temple forever. So now, God cursed them so that they all die early, but he'd still keep the original promise. And Dobson says, that's why I need to discipline you, because this one dad had two sons who he didn't, and then God cursed them. So a couple things. You don't have to read that as a metaphor for parenting.
Right.
I don't think it was written that way to be a metaphor for parenting. Dobson does, and I guess sure, but there's also 1,000 other ways to explain why discipline is important without making such a fucking stretch. A common verse that asks cite is about spanking is those who spare the rod hate their children, but those who love them are diligent to discipline them, which is Proverbs 13:24. You could read that as spanking, spare the rod, spoil the child. You could also take spare the rod to mean not discipline them in general, not have boundaries or structure. You don't have to read it as spanking for it to be a valid interpretation. But again, that's certainty. I am correct, and my correct interpretation just happens to reinforce the worldview that puts me on top. That's just because God loves me the most.
And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm going to tell you something really shocking that's going to just blow you out of your seat.
Wait. Okay, I'm ready.
Ready? I've never read the Bible. That was so good.
I don't think that will translate to audio.
No, but I will stay in my mind forever. That was the best spit take I've ever seen. But from what I understand, if you were to apply literal truth to every single thing, it's just a massive amount of contradictions, and it cancels itself right back out again.
Yeah. So another thing that evangelicals will push back against is that like the Bible contradicts itself. It objectively does. And it's because it was written by people in a context and wasn't meant to be the divinely inspired word of God. Let alone, we don't even need to get into the Nicene Council for this. But it objectively does. And you can find ways... Is
that from Twilight?
Yes, the Nicene Council from Twilight. They sparkle. You can find ways through your own interpretations to resolve some of those contradictions. Sure. Absolutely. But you also have to understand other people who believe the same things you do, who are just as invested in their relationship with God, can read the same things, interpret them differently, and technically would be a valid...
Yeah. I mean, it is open for interpretation. Even what you said earlier, like murder is wrong, is pretty open for interpretation. As we see by like pro-life, pro-choice, the idea that that's murder for some people and for other people not, the idea of the death penalty, the idea of self-defense, gun like control.
Different translations of the Bible. Does it say thou shalt not murder or thou shalt not kill? What are the we talked about this before, but like the word homosexuality did not appear in the Bible until the 50s. And it's a deliberate choice. That one was specifically politically motivated, but that's a deliberate choice to translate. And that will change how we view these things. millions of different interpretations of the Bible. Dobson cites like different interpretations in the same book, but then doesn't say like, oh no, the Bible is just one. The Bible, Christianity isn't just one thing. The Bible isn't just one thing. Dobson's ideology, once again, is a strict hierarchy of patriarchy, white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and capitalism. Like I said in our purity culture series, it is not enough just to go thing bad to the end. If we are deconstructing, we also need to construct something new. Here I'll say we're getting to very subjective areas. Unlike Dobson, I do not think that there is just one correct way to think about morals and values. There are many people I respect and have very significant differences in beliefs. I have loved ones who are Christian. I have loved ones who are Muslim. I have loved ones who are pagan or who are just vaguely spiritual. I have loved ones who are atheists. Pretty significant disagreements, and I also respect those differences. That said, Dobson rails against something I often heard described as secular humanism, which just so happens to describe my beliefs and values pretty well. So I want to take a moment and describe what those actually are, because Dobson doesn't do a good job of understanding them. Secular means non-religious. Whereas Dobson might take this to mean anti-religion, I mean it more as following a religion is not what makes you a good person.
Yeah.
It also means you can be a good person with or without religion. Humanism, to me, then, means centering and honoring the humanity of every person. There isn't a right way to be a person, and part of the human experience is embracing our individuality while staying in community with others who are different from us. This is where I get a lot of my values. Fighting for the rights of the marginalized, for me, stems from this. If all humans are of equal worth, and some group, let's call them, for instance, I don't know, arbitrarily the Palestinians, is suffering, I want to do everything I can to ameliorate that pain. And that's because I think that's what every person deserves.
But did you say ameliorate? You're smart.
Thank you.
It's a big word.
Thank you.
Good job.
I didn't spell it correctly in this Word document, but
Doesn't matter.
I know the word.
No, this is a listening blog.
Yeah. This is also where I get my beliefs as a political anarchist. And I'm going to do the shitty thing and derail us once again to talk more about anarchism.
Okay, great.
Anarchism as a political movement, and the way that I understand it and practice it, is not lawlessness of everyone for themselves. It's dismantling unjust hierarchies. Why do white people need to be on top? Just because some rich white people said so? That's stupid and clearly wrong. That's the philosophy behind this podcast. Anarchy and secular humanism, used in these ways at least, do not remove the idea of authority. Not every hierarchy is unjust. It also leaves room for other religious beliefs. You can draw similar values as me and they come from the Bible, and that's fine. I'm not disagreeing with that. It's not my beliefs are superior to yours. I do think parents have an obligation to create reasonable rules and structures for the kids and to reinforce those boundaries. I also agree that some behaviors do have natural consequences. It's okay to put a kid in timeout or to not let them watch TV as a punishment. That's fine. But since I believe that every human is equal, I don't believe parents own their kids. I don't believe they should be able to hit them. Similarly, I do think we should listen to experts. We can quibble about how to define an expert, and I think that's fair, but there are fundamentally people who are more qualified to make decisions on certain topics than others. I am a queer person. My experience in queerness, I don't want some cishet legislator being like, here's what the queer experience is like. Its allies are important for sure, but I know more about my experience than you ever will from reading a book. If I'm writing policy on disability rights, I want actual disabled people to write it, or at least contribute to it. Representation, one could call this. There's an important point in all of this as well. Dobson says people are fundamentally bad. He's railing against a culture that he describes that says people are fundamentally good. I don't believe either of that. There are some people who believe everyone deep down is good, but I actually don't think that that's a super widespread and influential belief the way Dobson makes it out to be. Dobson believes that people are fundamentally bad and sinful because a lady tried to eat healthy ones. I reject that people are both fundamentally good or bad. We're just people. We do good things, we do bad things. We all have the capacity to love and to hate. We can have incredible acts of altruism and compassion. We can all be cruel and sadistic. Even violent criminals have done good things, and usually have people who love them. And even the best people have done some horrible things. Google Mother Teresa if you want to know more.
Yeah.
We contain multitudes, and we can choose to do bad or good.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you because I know you're in a flow.
Yeah,
but
no.
like, as a therapist, I I think I did not anticipate how much the idea of good and bad would show up with all of my clients,
It's
right?
really ingrained, yeah.
It's really ingrained. And this idea of like, I want to be good, but X, Y, and Z are bad. And so then I have this moral conflict, right? But the X, Y, and Z are so arbitrary. It's like, I'm not exercising enough, or I'm not political enough, or I'm not whatever, right? And that is, it gets classified as I'm bad, right? I always talk a lot with my clients about the moral should, right? I should be doing this. I should be doing that. I should be more productive. I should be whatever. And because I'm not, because I didn't, I should do my laundry tonight. And because I didn't, I'm bad, right? And when you take the should out, it's just like neutral. It's like, and I didn't. I have dirty clothes, right? Like,
Yeah.
So I talk about that a lot because it's not a thing that really came up too much in school. And I'm like, this is like the main thing I'm talking about with people is, especially American people, right? Which is what most of my clients are, is this idea of like, I'm not producing, I'm not making something, I'm not benefiting somehow from this. And so I'm bad. So yes, people are complex and contain multitudes, and also do good and bad even really exist outside of the extremes, right?
Also, my next quote, what good and bad means are open to interpretation.
There we go.
Yes. Laws, which I think are important, are collectively agreed upon boundaries, but morals and mores are constantly changing. Homosexuality.
Right.
I believe it's a very neutral thing. Other people think that I should be put to death because I like sucking dick.
I'll always bring it back to this because this is a big part of the work that I do with my clients outside of grief clients is like size.
Yes.
Right? It is bad to be fat.
Oh my God, the moralizing around size. I'm sure I've done some of that work. I can only imagine.
Right. Like, I have a bad body. I want to have a good body. Right. And it's like, what does that mean? I think the question I ask my clients all the time, like fat and not fat, is like, do you actually find that body gross? Like, if you really just looked at it and you didn't have any society saying anything to you, what is gross, right?
Yeah.
What is bad about that body? So, it's really interesting how much we have that. Even people like me who grew up without religion and didn't grow up in this idea of a right and a wrong and a good and a bad, it's still very prevalent.
Humans are prone to black and white thinking. We just like sorting things into categories. And often, our thinking is ruled like largely by our emotions. And so if you say, this is bad, this makes you bad, that's actually a really good way of controlling people, which is what this is. Again, obedience, control. The beliefs that I have expressed here stand almost directionally opposed to Dobson's. So I get why he hates them so much. But those very beliefs are why I believe that this book is damaging. In Dobson's view, parents are God. In this, we talked about in the Bringing Up Boys Oops All Fascism episode, how it's kind of like fractalization. The family system is a smaller version of a community, it's a smaller version of a nation, right? It's also a smaller version of the relationship between God and human beings in Dobson's view. And in that role, parents are God.
Right.
Specifically, the husband is God. In Dobson's view, when parents are able to keep their calm and understand their child's motivation, they can dole out just the right level of pain to be corrective but not damaging. I don't believe that line exists. He ties in so many issues tangentially related to parenting, like abortion, the sacred nature of apple pie. He goes on a racist rant about Chicago for a second. I call it... I didn't get to this in the last episode, but in the script I wrote Chicago with a hard R. Is very much how it feels.
Why is everyone so mad at Chicago all the time?
Because of racism.
I know. It's so funny. We're just trying to stroll around by the lake.
Chicago is one of the best cities in the world.
Seriously.
But don't tell anyone, because then they'll want to move here.
Yeah, I don't want that. But people always act like I live in a like, how do you walk down the street without getting murdered?
There's a very certain way that people will talk about Chicago where I'm like, you're not saying anything explicitly racist. That's super racist.
Yeah. Yeah.
All of Dobson's worldviews just happen to explicitly put him on top, both by social location, being a rich white guy with a college degree who's fathered a family, and him specifically as God's interpreter. And if you believe him, God says you're right too. And you must be so faithful and attuned to God if you agree, which further shows how right you are to treat children like your property. The real, true moral lesson of the strong-willed child is blind obedience. Your kids better obey you. That's your main mission as a parent. And you better obey God. If you think you know better, you don't. And that's blasphemous. The late great comedian George Carlin once summarized the political divide as this. Folks on the left care about people, and folks on the right care about property. Mm. Obviously, the reality is a lot more nuanced, but that feels really applicable to this discussion. If you want someone to blindly and unquestioningly follow your orders, you don't really want to be in a relationship with them. You want to own them. Dobson treats children like property. He's at the top of the pyramid, so of course he does. The underlying beliefs of Christian nationalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, those at the top own everything, including you. Your employer owns you if they control your healthcare and your wages. Your parents should own you and raise you to however they please, damn the consequences. Your husband owns you as a wife, especially if he works and controls the money. Now, James Dobson didn't invent these systems, but he is a huge reason why they exist in their current forms. And this fucking awful book has caused untold damage to so many people and their families. Again, we will be revisiting this series at some point in the future, with an emphasis on the lived legacies of so-called strong-willed children. If you want to share your stories with us, you can reach out at ihatejamesdobson@gmail.com or on any of our social media channels. I hate Christian nationalism. I hate control and abuse masquerading as religion. I hate how stupid this fucking guy is, and I hate the systems that supported him and continue to support him. Brooke, I fucking hate James Dobson.
I hate James Dobson. I hate apple pie.
Cherry pie or nothing.
I'm just kidding. I don't really hate apple pie. But, I want you to know that is so true what you just said. And so that like really struck me. Like he's not really recreating God's will in the structure of the home. He's recreating America's will and the patriarchy in the structure of the home because it benefits him and people like him the most. Mm-hmm. Right? And I'm so curious what James Dobson's views on the world would be if he were any other identity, mm-hmm. right? Or if he had someone who he really cared about and loved in his life who was any other type of identity, right? Mm-hmm. Does he have kids?
He does have kids.
What do they think?
Oh, they are bought into the Kool-Aid.
Yuck.
I believe his son is Ryan Dobson. I think Ryan's like super involved in all of the like folks in the family, James Dobson Institute stuff.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're not gay.
And then there's girl child Dobson.
Yeah. She's the eldest. She has a name. I don't know what it is.
Yeah. All right. Well, I hate them all.
Yeah. Yeah. If any of them want to come on the podcast, we will. We won't hold back. We're not going to be nice about it, but we'd love to have you.
Oh my God. I would love it.
I would be professional in meaning that I would have come with points to talk about with them. But I also wouldn't hold back and I'd hold them to account to be like, hey, so you've caused all this damage. What do you have to say for yourself?
Yeah. I don't know what I would do. I'd be like, I'm just watching. I'm just here.
Reader, thank you for listening to this blog. And Brooke, they'll see you in 2 weeks and I'll see you at some point.
I'll see you like tomorrow at noon in our meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Back to work.
Thanks, readers.
Bye. I Hate James Dobson is Labor of Love, written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Jake. I'm honored to be joined by my amazing co-host, Brooke. If you're enjoying the show, please consider rating and reviewing it, and if you want to connect with us more, you can find us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube at I Hate James Dobson, and on Twitter at IHateJDobs. If you want to email us, you can do so at ihatejamesdobson@gmail.com. Special thanks to Drew, Lindsay, DJ, and Jack. Our theme music is by Mood Maze, and the song is called Trendsetter. Thank you for enjoying our show.
Let's have a little Diet Coke real quick.
Let's have a little Diet Coke.
Sorry.
As a treat.
Little treat.
Oh, I have corn dogs waiting for me at home.
You do?
I do. I mean, I have to, like, make them and stuff. But
Boy, just heat them up, right?
yeah. If I'm feeling real fancy, I'll do an oven. If I'm feeling real lazy, I'll do a microwave.